You are listening to a free version of the Majority Report with Sam Steeder. To support the show and get another 15 minutes of daily program, go to majority.fm, please.
The Majority Report with Sam Steeder.
It is Monday, January 23rd, 2017. My name is Michael Brooks on a Michael Monday, and this is the four-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On today's program, Murtaza Hussain of The Intercept, Trump, oil, Russia, Syria, debunking myths and setting the chart for the next several years in the Trump age. What comes next? Conflict, human rights, military buildup, and what's in store for us and what's an actual response of left-wing global solidarity. And Melissa Byrne, key digital strategist and organizer for Bernie Sanders. She's campaigning for the second position in the DNC, campaigning for vice chair of the Democratic National Committee. We'll talk about the DNC, her race for second in command. Is the DNC worth saving and how to save it? Plus, the torrent keeps coming. Legislation introduced in the House to withdraw the United States from the UN, to say that birth begins at fertilization. And it's official. KellyAnne Conway confirms that, of course, Donald Trump was lying about health care. They're going to block grant Medicaid. Millions of people almost certain to lose their health insurance. How's that looking, dum-dum left? It's happening. A lawsuit has already been filed due to foreign gifts that the Trump organization is receiving. Does that violate the Constitution? And Gambia's president, in a foreshadowing of our current president, I should say former president, Gambia's former president, agreed to leave office after losing an election, flew out of the country, waved to the crowds, and his successor administration has discovered that he's pretty much stolen all of Gambia's national budget. Hashtag Trump goals. And Israel announces the construction of new settlements in East Jerusalem because now they're no longer, quote unquote, muzzled by Obama. And at the same time, millions of Americans, by some estimates as high as 1% of the population, protested in marches across the country for women's rights, for civil rights, for radicalism, for anti-capitalism, for basic decency and humanity. The whole spectrum was covered. So the resistance has begun. This president comes in with historically low approval ratings. They're unleashing an agenda that will damage and hurt most people. And they play for keeps. But the resistance is here. People aren't deluded. And now it's really a form of trench warfare to save the country and hopefully renew it. We will elaborate on that. I want to play two brief pieces of sound. First, let's go. I think there were two moments, and I'll start with the more thuggish one that I enjoyed, and then one that's maybe slightly more elevating. But we all know about Richard Spencer. He's the leading scumbag, neo-Nazi, alt-right, whatever guy. Kind of looks like a T-Mobile assistant manager. He's gotten a bunch of profiles in places like the Los Angeles Times, Mother Jones, where they try to somehow glamorize him. But basically, it's just the old garbage in new sort of, now it's just kind of like 15 years out of date style versus 30-year out of date style, 40-year out of date style. Richard Spencer was in D.C. over the weekend, and he was punched in the face. And now, for your viewing pleasure, and I can only describe this so well on the podcast, you really will have to watch this on our YouTube channel. But basically, Richard Spencer's talking to a reporter. He's being a schmuck. He's explaining his Pepe the Frog pin. And then a guy comes out and punches him in the face. Now, I'm not going to comment on the punch, but I will comment on these remixes. We have 3 different versions of how this happened, set to 3 different pieces of music. And art shows and kinetic activity shows that it will thrive and exist in the Trump age. For your viewing pleasure, we'll go one by one now. Matt, take it away.
This first one is Jay-Z. It's by Fred from Honolulu.
Okay, beautiful. Go ahead.
Allow me to reintroduce myself. My name is Ho. H to the OV. I used to move snowflakes by the...
Okay. And now moving on from Jay-Z, we have another, and by the way, this is a could see that Phil and I had the Jay-Z Nas battle on Two Dope Boys in a podcast a couple of weeks ago, but this is all really bringing us together. Great use of a public service announcement by Jay-Z. And now, which one are we in for now, Matt?
This is @Retep Adam, and this is The Boys Are Back in Town.
Okay, go ahead.
The neo-Nazi movement? It's Pepe's become kind of a...
That's great. Okay, now these are all wonderful, and the video is wonderful, and we're all enjoying ourselves. But now we're about to hit a crescendo. I think everybody, obviously starting with the guy that did it, is doing a great job. But now we got to get to really the pinnacle that we've seen so far. Go ahead, Matt.
This is @Don Sueños, and I'm not going to spoil it.
Don't spoil it. Just take it away.
What? It's Pepe's become kind of a...
Oh my God. Well, you know what, man? Like, you gotta thank the Black Bloc for something. We'll get to more of that later, but let's keep it 100% here. That was
excellent choice of targets and timing there.
During
the Pepe pin discussion.
Oh my God. You know, Natasha Leonard, we'll get to this later, but people talked about watching Roger Federer as this sort of like flawless kinetic activity. And it's true. He's an incredible tennis player. And the elegance of the punch, the timing, the facial recoil. I mean, it just, whoever did that, who of course I hope will always remain anonymous until Byrne gets elected and gives a general amnesty for everyone who's punched Richard Spencer in 4 years.
Medal of Valor.
Yeah, Medal of Valor.
Why does he look surprised that he got punched? That's the funnier part afterward. Like, you have to know if you're walking around and you're him that you're going to get punched.
I mean, dude, honestly, you would be like in the zone of getting punched, like even if you weren't saying all of that stuff. Like, you just look annoying.
Yeah.
You know? Let's be, you know. All right. That's such an awesome point. I love that. All right. Let's go. I think this is the range of attitudes and things that we need to have happen in the next 4 years. So let's go from fighting fascists on the street to, I'm sorry, man, I have always had a soft spot for John Kerry, and this solidifies it. John Kerry, who refused to go to the inauguration, was the highest ranking official, I believe, to not go, decided to take a stroll on Saturday morning with his very awesome dog, and he went to the Women's March. And they asked him what he was doing there, and this is what he had to say.
Secretary, what's your comment to Mr. Trump today?
Just here to support the rally. We're not going backwards.
That's great. John Kerry, you know, it's very interesting to watch people reveal themselves in good and bad ways during all of this. And that's significant. That's significant that John Kerry's there. And I like his dog. there is an incredible amount of information to keep up with in this time, as we all know. It's just a torrent of bad news, frankly, but you need to understand it. You need to come up with it. You need to contextualize it. And also, this is still the time of year where everyone's traveling. There's no way you're going to cram all of the magazines you want to read into one carry-on bag. And you can with Texture, the new app that gives you unlimited access to over 200 magazines. So, look, you all know that in order to do this job, you need to stay informed. There's a number of things that you need to keep on top of, and Texture definitely makes it much easier. It has everything, or you can keep up with specific people. Obviously, I always read Rolling Stone on Texture. I never miss a column by Matt Taibbi. He's in that essential category. I read Fast Company for Two Dope Boys and a Podcast Stories. And then to get out of the insanity or to follow another guy that I really like and respect, Coach Popovich, I might pop open Sports Illustrated. It's all on the Texture app. That and many, many more. Texture has gone beyond delivering just the magazine itself. They made it easier to find and enjoy the article you want with daily recommendations, exclusive interactive features, videos, and more. Texture's searchable, and you can mark what you like, check out back issues, view bonus video content, and you can curate articles and magazines just for you or whoever you're giving Texture to this year. Why on earth would you subscribe to just a couple of magazines when you can have all the best ones in your smartphone or tablet all the time for way less? Right now, Texture is offering my listeners a 14-day free trial. You really should try this. It is an incredible app. When you go to texture.com/majority, that's 14 days to try Texture for free. When you go to texture.com/majority, texture.com/majority. And now I want to tell you about stamps.com. It's what we use to send out merch. When we finally do that. Hopefully it will help us send out merch. We know we owe you all merch, and Stamps.com can obviously help us do that. Help us get rid of the hassle of going to the post office. You know that it's you want to make 0 trips there. It's very crowded. And with thanks to Stamps.com, if you're sending a bunch of stuff, if you're Stamps.com, you don't have to worry about it. Just use Stamps.com to this is what I really like. You can automatically calculate and print the correct amount of postage for every letter or package you send. Stamps.com brings all of the services of the U.S. Postal Service right to your fingertips. Buy and print official postage for any letter, any package, any class of mail using your own computer and printer. Stamps.com makes it easy. They'll send you a digital scale to automatically calculate the exact postage. Stamps.com will even help you decide the best class of mail based on your needs. Stamps.com saves you money. They give you postage discounts you can't get at the post office, including 3 cents off of every first-class stamp. Anything you can do at the post office, you can now do from your desk, and you'll never have to go to the post office again. Right now, use my code MajorityReport for this special offer. A 4-week trial includes postage and digital scale. Go to Stamps.com, click on the microphone at the top of the homepage, and type in Majority Report. That's Stamps.com. Enter Majority Report and sign up today with Stamps.com. You'll never have to go to the post office again. And are you hiring? Do you know where to post your job to find the best candidates? Posting your job in one place isn't enough to find quality candidates. If you want to find the perfect hire, you need to post your job at all the top job sites, and now you can. ZipRecruiter, I'm talking about. ZipRecruiter already has 9 million resumes you can search through on their database. You can add multiple people to your account and make it the most efficient for your team to find the best hire. With ZipRecruiter.com, you can post your job to 100 plus sites, including social media networks like Facebook and Twitter, all with a single click. ZipRecruiter is a search engine for finding and posting jobs. Find a candidate in any city, industry nationwide. Just post once and watch your qualified candidates roll into ZipRecruiter's easy-to-use interface. No juggling emails or calls into your office. Quickly screen candidates, rate them, hire them, right person fast. If you have any issues, ZipRecruiter's friendly and human, Support staff is ready to help you. Find out today why ZipRecruiter has been used by over 1 million businesses, as featured on Forbes, Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, New York Times, TechCrunch, and CBS. ZipRecruiter's website shows trending fields, career fields, and cities and searches. And right now, my listeners can post jobs on ZipRecruiter for free by going to ZipRecruiter.com/majority. That's ZipRecruiter.com/majority. You can try it for free. Go to ZipRecruiter.com/majority. We will be right back with Murtaza Hussain on the Majority Report.
Tried to tell Nick in 2012, working hand to hand and no avail. Volume 1 was too heavy for you frail Nick, so I got lean like codeine and pills. It's the visionary in the vintage Chevy. It's been a while, but wow, you still care. Free Nash till they pass out obituaries in bold caps. Yo, was not there. And I could do anything but move backwards. The hardest thing is to keep from being distracted. My big sister still claiming me on the taxes. Tell Uncle Sam I just need a second to add this. Gave my mama 10 racks and she packed and went to Chumash with it. Could triple the worth and gave me half of it. Half of it I tucked in the back of the air mattress. A quarter stash was stashed in the box with the Air Maxes. The rest got lost in sacks with my wife in no BM. Whack, dropping links in my DM. Bad been down in TL. I'm glad that you finally made it to the future, but you late in the prices through the roof. If you want, you could wait outside the building. I ain't taking no more meetings. Step in the water was cold. She my body, but not my soul. I bring you greetings from the First Church of Boone Baptist, United Fellowship of Free Nationals, residing pastor is Dot Pack, and the First Lady is a with slanted eyelids and thick sunglasses. Martin Luther King fan for you. You're sweating on my patent leather. Pressure turn this featherweight into a Cinderella. I ain't seen the ground in days since I grew propellers. And do you want better? Word to the liquor that killed my grandpa liver. I know you're finally proud and smiling. For every 100 that came and gone missing, only a handful will go the distance. I swear I seen you coming as if I was living up under the plumbing while was riffing and mumbling about what they could do. I was kicking gumbo, whipping the voodoo. I was in the jungle running with Zulus. We was looking past the struggle while life was moving so
Welcome back to the Majority Report. I'm Michael Brooks. Joining us now is Murtaza Hussain. He is a reporter for The Intercept. Murtaza, how you doing?
Good, man. Thanks for having me.
It's really good to be talking with you. This conversation is long due, but not happening in the best of circumstances. But let's try to do the best we can here. You obviously cover international affairs, Middle East, civil liberties, Islamophobia, and sort of that realm for The Intercept. And we're kind of heading into we're in the Trump age now. And one of the things that strikes me out of the gate, and what we've seen in the last sort of, just say since the inauguration, in the last 48 hours, is that on certain issues, obviously, Donald Trump being Donald Trump, he's perfectly willing to lie about. So if that means protecting Medicare or Medicaid as an example, no problem breaking promises there. On the other hand, the sort of personality that he campaigned on and his sort of who he is and how he positions himself, I think he's actually ironically been incredibly transparent, and he's not going to change. And there's no moment where he's going to say, oh, I'm president now. I can't, be irrational and pick bizarre fights with people and obsess, right? And I think on foreign policy, to some extent, to the extent that he has really articulated anything, it actually seems like he might be kind of rather serious about his agenda. So, he's already kind of pulling out of trade agreements. He's went to the CIA, and in addition to giving a sort of, everybody talks about the crazy speech that he gave, but he reiterated his sort of calls around ISIS and everything else. So I guess my first question to you out of the gate is, if we're taking Donald Trump seriously, that he actually means this stuff, that this is his foreign policy, what does that mean concretely for what the world is going to be plunged into over the next couple of months?
I think it's very interesting to view him in the full scope of contemporary history in the United States since the end of World War II. Because the Cold War, in a sense, it ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union, but there was still that sort of the underlying dynamics of it still continued in many ways, especially on the American side. People, in large part, continue to view America having a specific role in Europe. They continue to have a specific perception of Russia and what the United States' position in the world is as the superpower in that superpower binary, where Russia had sort of fallen off its horse for a large part. And they continue to have that sort of role. So NATO was still a very important institution, for instance, because the U.S. role in Europe is to protect the Western states and to expand their realm of influence. So that way of looking at the world sort of started to lose resonance after a while, because people were like, well, the Soviet Union's gone, et cetera, et cetera. And I think Trump is like the final nail in the coffin of that worldview, and is in fact switching to a completely different view where, well, let's look at the new Russia, which is a very right-wing, aggressive, chauvinistic state, and let's embrace that. And in reality, our new enemy are going to be, if you would describe it very broadly, the forces of globalization. So countries in the third world, if you notice, China is a country which Trump has signaled a very early and aggressive sort of hostility towards, and many of his appointees have spoken similarly. Right. So I think that what you're going to see is a realignment from the Cold War era way of looking at the world towards more of a, it's still taking shape, so I don't want to say definitively, but an alliance against Asia and the Middle East in favor of pushing back against globalization in all its different forms.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think that there's also analogs to this inside Russia. There's Russian sort of foreign policy strategists that make the distinction between, as an example, like landlocked nations that preserve tradition and ocean-faring nations that sort of want to globally link, and that's the sort of eternal battle in global and international politics. What you just pointed to raises so many things that we'll get to when we specifically focus on Syria. I think it's one thing for the left, broadly speaking, and it's been interesting to watch the response to the Russia thing. I think some people, obviously, on the sort of more establishment side, want to focus on Russia to the exclusion of every other sort of relevant variable to examine in light of this, catastrophe we're in, and that's ridiculous. And I wouldn't take anything the intelligence services say at face value. But then, in contrast, there is a sort of contingent that has this bizarre notion that Russia is somehow either like rightly aggrieved, which, maybe they are in specific issues, but somehow that Russia, instead of this chauvinist far-right power, which as you identify them, they're a far-right petro-state, which is not sort of like something you would think the left would be particularly fond of, but somehow is this sort of anti-imperialist, properly aggrieved resistor of the Western order. And I guess I wanted you to speak to that, and then just as a brief kind of addendum to that, it also strikes me that when we criticize NATO or we criticize the Western order for violating human rights, for focusing on the expansion of markets at the expense of other important goals and values, I think people like us have been calling for an improvement on the system, not a regression. And not enough people are making that distinction.
Absolutely. So I think there are two components to it. First, there's which should be a germane point, that there can be more than one villain in the world.
Right.
And when the United States puts plus somewhere, just putting minus doesn't necessarily, it's not a foolproof sort of way of looking at the world. Like, contrarianism is not an ideology which is like coherent or necessarily humane.
Right.
Russia is an imperial power as well. It's also an imperial power in the world, not just predating even the Soviet Union. It's always been imperial power, including the Middle East. now they've undertaken this intervention in Syria, and you can say I would describe it as one among several evils which have been undertaken in Syria in the last few years. To sort of take this binary view that anything that is perceived to be in opposition to the United States, and if you examine closely what's going on in Syria, the United States and Russia are, in large part, on many broad themes, are very much alike. They're not. There may be some tactical or superficial differences in their policies, but they're not actually that different.
Right.
They both have committed to quote-unquote stability in the country, which at this juncture means propping up the government, and that's what Russia's policy aims to do. So I don't think that I think that just saying that if Russia is doing something which the U.S. is protesting against, well, that means it's good because what's going on in Syria isn't bad. That's a very simplistic and lazy way of looking at things, and anyone examining much more closely would be equally outraged at Russia's imperial policy as they are at America's imperial policies in Iraq and Syria and elsewhere.
Right.
And I think it raises a really interesting point, too, that, if there are problems, deep, grievous problems with the international order, with NATO as they exist right now, but the solution of just blowing all these institutions up because they've made mistakes and they have serious issues, and because Russia shares those goals, Russia is a friend then in blowing them up, that's not, this is very irresponsible. This actually, you can easily blow up a bad order and replace it with a much worse order. That's also a very easy proposition. Incrementally improving things would be a lot better. That takes a lot more thinking and a lot more, it's a much more purposeful sort of way of looking at things. But just because you get enemy of your enemy is not necessarily a friend. It could be a much worse enemy, which we could be seeing here.
Yeah, I mean, let's get and zero in on Syria in a second, but it's very striking to me that in Europe, it is really, in some ways, a contingent of people who were like in Green parties, as an example, who got their start in the sort of 68 left, fighting U.S. imperialism in Vietnam, fighting for disarmament, putting the environment at the top of the global agenda. Now, some of these people like Joschka Fischer, they've moved very much to the mainstream, maybe more to the right in certain areas than I would. And I think, obviously, again, Europe has created its own problems through destroying Greece through austerity, as an example. But it is the people who have a sense of what that umbrella has at least been able to create domestically in Europe, which, again, if we're being real, for all of its flaws, has generated, robust social safety nets, does more on foreign aid and development than other, sort of comparable economic powers, which are just the United States and China. And they're the ones that are very concerned about that sort of shift in Europe. And I think that, with Russia, and we'll get to Syria this way, we don't need to even get into the minutia of all of these various different intelligence reports and contesting of that. I think it's obvious that Russia had a preference and they preferred Trump, and there is some type of connection there, because you don't need to go to intelligence reports to know that, Paul Manafort is connected to Russia, right? And he managed Trump's campaign. That's right there. That's it. Okay? We know these things. But we also know that Russia, as an instrument of foreign policy, is quite cozy with the European far right. And the European far right is not dismantling or committed to destroying the EU because they're upset about austerity and lack of social justice and too much power for corporations. They're upset about immigration. They're upset about multiculturalism. Now that takes us to Syria, because the paradox here is that the support of the Assad regime is the support of another, far right reactionary government. There's no secret anti-imperialist sauce here. And I guess, maybe you could take us backwards a little bit through introducing Russia's role into Syria and the fact that now we've already been sort of cooperating with them, what it's going to look like under Trump. But, in the process of getting there, I think there's a lot of myths that have unfortunately been sort of seeding up on the left about the U.S. and Russian roles in Syria, which aren't just in and of themselves wrong-headed. They might lead to a sympathy for the type of foreign policy brutality we're talking about, and related to that, indirectly, a problematic response to the refugee crisis as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that your point about Russia's interests and Russia's relationships in Europe is very well taken, because it's known that Russia bankrolls a lot of far-right parties in Europe. They bankrolled, it's known that they funded or helped fund the Front National in France.
Yep.
So they have a very pronounced goal in breaking up the post-war European order. And I think that it's very important when you're looking at that order to acknowledge its failings and acknowledge the areas where it very drastically needs to be improved. But there are very real, tangible reasons why it was created in the first place, and things which it has accomplished in the last 70 years. The reason that Trump makes a very point, which I think many people on the left and the right tend to see as making sense, that, well, NATO is an antiquated institution, and many these international, we have relationships with these countries. They're holdovers from the end of World War II. What's the purpose of it? We should be focusing on the real threat to us, which is terrorism. Mm-hmm. Interstate warfare, which these institutions are supposed to prevent, is no longer a salient factor in our political lives. We need to focus on these networks of terrorists. But the thing is, the reason interstate warfare is no longer a threat to our lives is because we created these institutions to stop them. In Europe, the norm for pretty much all of European history up till the last 70, 80 years was interstate warfare. And now, miraculously, we have this sort of system which prevents it. And in doing so, it knitted all the countries of Europe together into the supranational entity, which is the manifestation of the EU. Now, the Front National and all these far-right parties and Russia, they want to see a reemergence of nationalism in Europe. Now, that's anyone with knowledge of European history knows that it's not a comforting sort of phenomena that would come about. So I think that it's very short-sighted, and I think that it's very easy to take a polemical view of history and just want to blow the thing up, but I don't think that that is the measured approach to be taken. And I think that people, especially on the left, they find it uncomfortable or sort of curious that they're agreeing with the Pat Buchanans or even the David Dukes of the world on certain foreign policy issues, because I think actually the right-wing people have a more clear idea of what's going on here and what the goals are.
Right.
The left are just taking the view that they're anti-establishment, but they don't have a positive vision for what replaces that establishment. They're just fellow travelers in a very troubling and scary project.
Right. If America's involved or there's a criticism of the United States, that's all I need to know, and I can form an analysis. Versus the reality that the United States is a problem, Russia's a problem. There's many different variables. So use Syria as a case study of where we've gotten, and I think work it backwards from the beginning of U.S. engagement in Syria to Russia's engagement and how we've come to the policy we're at now, and now we're at the sort of verge of what you say has kind of been informally happening in the last couple of years, might be about to sort of more overtly happen after Trump, which is a alliance with Assad. And, in the process, explain why, Assad isn't this sort of, misunderstood anti-imperialist, or this is all about some secret pipeline deal, or, all these other things that the only opposition to him is ISIS or Al-Qaeda. These are the myths that sort of seed on right and left. You can debunk those in the process of explaining how we got here.
Yeah. So it's a very messy and tragic case, what happened in Syria. In 2011, on the wave of the Arab Spring, there were huge, unprecedented demonstrations in Syria, not calling for the removal of the government, but calling for reform, basic reforms, which had not been enacted in 42 years of rule by one family over an entire country. It's not a socialist or in any way progressive regime, despite the fact that they use that terminology and that language to frame themselves in a very hollow manner. It's a family dynasty, it's a monarchy, a republican monarchy, basically, that has been created in that country. And instead of responding to the protests with agreements to impose incremental reforms, they use brute violence to try to snuff it out. Many very inspiring and heroic individuals, anarchists, leftists, revolutionaries, were treated most brutally by the Assad government. They were tortured to death in their prison chambers over the last several years. They disappeared off the face of the earth. They were killed, driven into exile. And the Assad regime sent a very strong message that, and they say it in their own slogans, very openly, that we're going to rule the country forever. And our only goal is forever, forever. And that's our ideology. Absolute power, indefinitely, with no recourse. Assad is not, I think there's a great confusion among some people. He's not Fidel Castro or any of the left-wing revolutionary leaders who employed violence as a means of achieving a certain social project. There's no social project here besides absolute power and the manipulation of divisions within society to maintain that power, setting people against each other, even at the expense of great human catastrophes and degradation, just so we can maintain on top by any means necessary.
Would you say, just as a brief summary, that like we could explain the Assad regime as like clan power and reward system with a fascistic security structure centered around actually a version of sort of neoliberal economics?
That's an absolutely very good description, because as you mentioned very well at the end too, they're not socialists in a sense. They're absolute neoliberals to the nth degree, committed to, and they also have taken part in the United States war on terror. They were a very fulsome member of the rendition program. Right. There's nothing at all anti-imperial about them. They've always sought a very prominent role for themselves in the imperial game in the Middle East, and they've always sought to cozy up to the American president whenever it's possible, including Donald Trump. Bashar al-Assad has been very vocal about the fact that he sees Trump as a partner, because Trump is not someone who cares about human rights or cares about any liberal or progressive ideals. He's someone who's interested in having borders closed up and come what may in other countries. It's not his problem. And I think that this, again, is where you see this very troubling and sort of thoughtless convergence between right and left, because there are two ways you can look at Assad. You can look at him, two wrong ways of looking at him. You can look at him as an anti-imperialist hero, which I think that's very clear upon further analysis he's not. Or you can look at it in the sense that, I just don't care about what goes on in other countries, and the important thing to me is American policy, because I'm an American, and my number one concern is just not to be involved. And the thing is, this is a view which is not distinguishable in any way from the view of Pat Buchanan. Pat Buchanan also says, I'm just not interested in the world, and whatever's going on in Syria, good or bad, I just don't want to, America has nothing to do with it. We should stay out of it. And in a way, it's understandable, and it's a way it's preferable to trying to do harm. The thing is, traditionally, leftists have had a international humanitarian vision. And it's not to say that we're going to command the U.S. Army to intervene. We should not look at things in terms of states and factions. Our tradition is to look at things in terms of people and movements. So there are Syrian leftists and anarchists and revolutionaries who have who lived this experience of the past several years. They have a project against the Assad regime and a very fulsome critique of the Assad regime and their own program for what they want to accomplish in Syria. And when you reduce everything down to what's Russia doing, what's the U.S. doing, what's the Syrian government doing, what's Turkey doing, they get obliterated in that narrative, because they're not the ones, just like us in the West. We exist, we're leftists, we have a project, but we're not the ones controlling armies or states. So if you look at the U.S. in terms of Trump versus the Democrats, you'll miss a big part of the picture, the most important part. And that's the thing what we're doing. And that's the thing where the problem comes in, is when you just look at it in terms of different factions and how, they interact with each other, you make invisible the most important part and the people who actually started the Syrian revolution and who are still pursuing it.
So I want, and we only have a couple minutes left, but I want to get the conclusion of what the left in Syria is asking for us. But before we do that, could you kind of, because it's obviously very complicated. There's many different factions, but I know as an example, I would like you to kind of debunk some sort of main narratives we hear. Because as an example, every time I've had a conversation about Syria in any way, shape, or form, anything that starts with the premise that, of course, the opening of the uprising in 2011 was an organic, citizen-driven event, always gets met with like, no, that was like a secret CIA plot or something like that, even though that makes like less than no sense just strategically. Then there's always the idea of an oil pipeline somewhere and who got that contract. Now, again, Syria's always been willing to play ball with the West. And then there's the notion that, Syrian opposition is purely just made up of these dangerous terrorist factions. And I just want to say, briefly, I know you'll elaborate on it. I mean, number one, still by far the largest body count in Syria and causer of civilian casualties is the Assad regime. Number two, the Assad regime would not have survived without their own massive foreign intervention from Russia and Iran. And, number three, I think to some extent, Assad clearly, by cracking down, as you said, most brutally on the left, was selecting his enemy that he wanted by facilitating groups like Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS. So even if we're worried about the terrorist dimension emanating from Syria, we still can't disconnect that from Assad, because Assad was playing a long game of knowing that if that becomes the prime story of the opposition, then he's going to get let off the hook. And that's actually exactly what's happened. So maybe you could do some myth debunking, and then we can explain, what the left in Syria would actually want from in terms of solidarity before we wrap up.
So the first point that what happened in Syria was not an organic uprising, was triggered by the CIA.
Right.
It's so divorced from reality that I just have to attribute it to a form of narcissism.
Yeah.
That all events in the U.S., all events in the world, it has to be either a product of the U.S. doing X or Z, right, or X, Y, or Z. Has to be there has to be an angle to it. And it's just very hard for people to grasp that not everything in the world is about the United States.
Right.
It's going on in Syria. The U.S. has played a role in the last 5 years, but I don't think the U.S. is even close to being the prime mover, even at this point, of what's going on there.
They haven't wanted to be.
Syria has their own history. They have their own struggles and their own beliefs. I don't think that people in the U.S. even really knew much about Syria before this conflict, and I still don't think they know. So the idea that what happened was from the CIA is just it's a form of narcissism, which you should say about it. The second point about pipelines and there was a conspiracy to undermine the Syrian government. The United States had good relations with Syria. It's always had pretty good relations with Syria during this time. There was a great movement for rapprochement, which was led by John Kerry himself with Bashar al-Assad. And it's forgotten today, but when the uprising first started, Hillary Clinton said that I think Bashar al-Assad's a reformer. Right. They defended him.
Yep.
And so did Erdogan, who is the most implacable enemy today. These people all said that, no, let's give him some time. I'm sure he'll work this out. They were not at the forefront of saying, let's topple him. Their goal, as always, including, by the way, the goal of the Israeli military establishment, was to flip Assad and to turn him onto our side, because they knew that this is someone we can work with and who's given every indication that he's willing to work with them. Because he's not interested in disrupting their plans. He's interested in maintaining power, and they can deal with that. So it's completely a myth that he was this implacable enemy or some sort of revolutionary force in the Middle East. And lastly, this idea that the only options in Syria ever were Assad or these fundamentalist Contras. It's absolutely false as well, too. It's not only is it his narrative, he has done the most to try to manufacture it by brutally and viciously repressing any democratic, liberationist, revolutionary opposition, being the most violent towards them, and letting out and creating his own opposition as much as possible among extremist groups. And the thing is, people always attribute it as a conspiracy that Assad has a relationship with ISIS. But the reason that people have this belief is during the Iraq War, he was very openly a patron of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which is the predecessor organization to ISIS. He facilitated their transport and their recruitment into Iraq, and there are deep ties between the government and these extremist groups in the first place. So he's very happy to see a binary between him and them, because that's the only way he can, in any sense, make himself palatable given the horrific crimes he's committed in full light of the world. The thing is, the uprising, which was not started by any specific groups. It just started with people taking up arms to defend the protests, because the protests were being attacked. And these groups, these individuals start coalescing into disparate militias. There was never one monolithic force called the Free Syrian Army. It was just a bunch of people in self-defense groups against the government, and then it attracted army defectors. And then over time, different states did get involved, and they funded militias, and it became a nexus of competing forces.
Because the Gulf does fund terrorist groups and groups like Al-Qaeda, and they start to play their own sort of, that's when it becomes the chess game in the Middle East. And Iran comes in, the Gulf has their agenda, U.S. has its agenda, Russia has its agenda. But none of that mitigates the actual foundation of the initial moves against Assad or his response to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the problem people get into conceptually is they don't recognize that there can be more than two sides in a civil war. There can be many, many sides. And you and I, we're not, it's not incumbent upon us to choose between evil and evil. When there is good out there, and you can always support people who are fighting for the original goals of the opposition in various forms. And this idea that there's a binary between extremists and Assad, he himself is, and when you look at it in terms of brutality and violence, it's as unpalatable as supporting ISIS. There's maybe even more so in some ways, because he has committed and continues to commit crimes on an unfathomable scale. Prisons, chemical weapons, massacres. So to support him is just as unpalatable as to saying ISIS is a lesser evil because look what Assad's done. It's both unacceptable positions. The fact is there are still opposition groups and activists and organizations who are deserving people's support, and accepting his, I'll say this about them, and I think pretty much any Syrian will agree, that this is a very smart government. These people are not stupid. They know exactly how people in America think. They know what buttons to press to galvanize support and how to psychologically manipulate populations in the West. They know that there's a fear of Islamists and so forth, and they manipulate that, and they continue to manipulate that, both the left and the right. I think the thing with the left is they don't know they're being manipulated. They have a much less clear view of what's going on than the right, which is very open about what they believe. And
because the right doesn't care about the humanitarian things. I mean, as a final question, what does, and I know that, and I'll recommend everybody needs to read all of Murtaza's coverage of this and in general, but because you've interviewed leaders from the Syrian left who've actually helped, are on the ground and have been on the ground, what is their request? If we were to get out of our own sort of narcissistic conspiracy bubble and engage in actual global solidarity in that situation, what would the ask be from the Syrian left before we sign off?
There is a growing movement right now in the United States to, Donald Trump was elected, a man whose foreign policy is, let's just side with Bashar al-Assad.
Yep.
This is the last thing people in the Syrian left want, to see, after so much bloodshed and sacrifice, that the world will just accept the same leader and government back into the fold of the international community after all his crimes. Nothing could be more devastating after the great sacrifices people have undertaken. I think that there's two things that three very practical things that people can do to support the cause of justice in Syria. Number one is to oppose the normalization of relations with the government absent fundamental political change and accountability for human rights abuses, particularly the disappeared, tens of thousands of disappeared people in Syrian prisons. They should be released. They should be accounted for before there's any talk at all of reintegrating this government in any fashion into the international community. There has to be some political change after all the bloodshed that's happened if the U.S. should reestablish relations with Syria. And there should be, among the 5 million refugees who have been dispersed around the world, I think that what's going to happen now, which you may see in Europe and the United States and elsewhere, is that with the rise of far-right governments, they're going to want to cooperate with the Syrian regime to return these people, or to go through them and find the really hated activists and ship them back to Syria, or ship everyone back to Syria en masse, whether they want to go back or not. These people do not want to live in Syria. They left for a reason.
Right.
They're terrified of the government, and they're full of resentment for people who murdered and raped and drove them out of their homes. And Le Pen would be glad to send them back. She didn't care. As you said, the right does not care about the human rights. They're very realist, quote unquote. So opposing that and helping those people organize and get a political voice for themselves is very important. And lastly, and I see it more, and I'm gratified, and I think even myself I should have done this more sooner, but just to elevate the voices of Syrian leftists. Let them, give them a voice in left-wing publications in the United States to articulate themselves at length. People who are legitimate activists, who are not tied to any foreign government or structure, who've done grassroots work for themselves, let them tell their story, and they can articulate what's going on in this confusion far better than any of us can. And I think that's our duty as leftists, internationalists, to elevate their voices, and to very fundamentally, this is the root of all of this, to concede there are things that we don't know best. Right. Someone else can explain their country best. And whether we agree with what they're saying or not, if we let them articulate themselves intelligently, we can all benefit. The path of what to do will become quite clear.
Murtaza Hussain, I appreciate your time immensely, and we'll do it again soon. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
All right, be well. All right, we're running really late, so we're going to get right to a little bit more music, and we will be back with Melissa Byrne, unless she has lost it because I'm so late. I'm sorry, Melissa. I hope you're listening, and I hope you accept my apology. Do you need a sec, Matt? All right, we will be right back with Melissa Byrne. Welcome back to the Majority Report. I'm Michael Brooks. Joining us now is Melissa Byrne. She's a longtime organizer, a Bernie Sanders alum, and she's a candidate for vice chair of the Democratic National Committee. Melissa, thanks for joining us. How are you?
I'm great, but also I'm aghast at how bad our country is right now with Donald Trump. So that's always it's a hard question these days.
Yeah, no kidding. And I think it's actually also a more honest question these days. It's less of a formality. It's like literally, how are you?
Yeah, it's like we don't want to just say yeah, because then it's just like, wait a second, you're missing huge problems that are happening.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I think that in some ways the way you answered that is a good indication as to why you should certainly be assuming the mantle of vice chair of the Democratic National Committee. I want to, though, ask you out of the gate a question that I know a lot of people watching and listening will have. And I come at this from an angle where I actually don't necessarily agree with this concern, but I understand very much where it's coming from. What faith do you still place in the Democratic Party, and why is it the vehicle that you want to sort of focus on primarily as we face this really unprecedented sort of danger we're in right now?
I mean, that's a hard question. I think it's what the Democratic Party is an incredible vehicle for being able to make progressive change if the right people show up to do the work. I think for a long time, I know for me, I've always vacillated between like, well, I do Democratic stuff, but I do Occupy work, or I do Democratic work on campaigns, or I work on the outside to make college free and to get rid of student loans.
Right.
And I think it's right to jump between the inside and the outside. And right now, we need the vehicle of the Democratic National Committee and of the Democratic Party, so that way we have the ability to win races all over the country in the next couple of years. And right now, the Democratic Party needs to really rebuild trust. Last year was a trust-breaking year as opposed to a trust-building year. And as organizers, we don't have the luxury to pick which battlefields we fight on. We don't get to sit in a room and like map everything out and say, well, this is where I want to fight. The fights come to you. And right now, one of the most important fights that we have is to have people who are progressive and progressive leaning, who want a better economy, who want a better environment, who want abortion rights protected, who want DACA protected and expanded to include all immigrants who are looking for safety and security to be protected. And the fastest way to do that is by rebuilding the Democratic Party to be an inclusive, strong, progressive party. And that's why I'm running for DNC vice chair.
The other thing that is very important that you've articulated, and you articulated this very well in your Medium post where you announced your candidacy, you know, there was this schism that got opened up, I think, in primarily in the primary with Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. And we need to make some distinctions. There's a lot that everybody from both sides can learn. I think there's some people who have clearly a very limited understanding of racial and cultural and gender issues, frankly. And I think there's also some people who, from the spectrum of either not understanding economic and inequality issues or, you know, on both sides, unfortunately, maybe a tendency to really sort of try to underplay them because of the respective positions they're coming from. And the fact that that division in some ways, and it's overrepresented in kind of social media nonsense, but the fact that that has continued after the primary, where people are still sort of attempting to drive these wedges inside progressive politics, when, of course, all of these issues are intertwined, integrated. They're not the same thing, but they are inseparable. You've made the point that all of those things need to be synchronized and addressed at once in order for any kind of viable progressive politics. And I'd like you to elaborate on that.
Sure. I'm lucky for me that I grew up in South Jersey, in Vineland to be precise. And from when I started public school in fifth grade through high school, my schooling was incredibly diverse, 30% white, 30% black, 30% Puerto Rican, 10% other groups, other identities, like from Asian American to different Latino groups, to refugees. And what I learned in that environment is, one, diversity is critical, even to the point that I took it for granted. I thought that was normal. It wasn't until I went to college and saw everybody sitting around me that was white that I understood how special it was where I grew up. But also in my school district, what I saw is the honors program and the gifted program were basically 100% white, and not just white from affluent background. So in sixth grade, when I thought I would be put into the gifted program because I got straight A's in fifth grade, did well in all the testing, I wasn't put into gifted. And it took my mom fighting for 6 months for me to be able to get into the gifted program, because they did a strict tracking program. So if you weren't in gifted in sixth grade, you couldn't get into pre-algebra or algebra or honors. So your entire academic career was based on where somebody placed you in sixth grade, which is absurd.
Right.
And tracking
and highly racialized, right?
Racialized and class. And
right.
so
Class.
for me,
right.
I learned
right.
as a 12-year-old the reality of like seeing racism and seeing classism up close and personal. And in 8th grade, seeing how all of like my people in gifted got pushed into higher programs, and people of color and lower income people of all backgrounds were pushed into general ed, and then a few into the college prep classes. And so for me, seeing that, it's not something I learned in a textbook. It's not something that I learned sitting around theorizing with people on social media. It was a reality of what I saw growing up and saw the importance of fighting. Like I remember being like in my honors history 2 class and people saying that, well, I've made the point, like, why is our classes like, why is everybody in here white? And there are people, some people were like, well, we just work harder. And I'm like, no, this is tracking. This is so systematic. I didn't have the vocabulary of like systematic racism. So I don't remember what words I used, but I used the words that were like in my vocabulary as a 16-year-old in a public high school in South Jersey.
So
for me, it's always been about these issues all intersecting and not competing with each other.
Right. And that's, again, and these conversations are not theoretical. This is essential to any kind of response to Trump. There's going to be, this is the last kind of broad sort of strategic question I want to ask you, and then I want you to let people know how they can help you or find out more about you. You know, I think, and obviously we were on the same side of the primary, though you were a much more important part of it than I was. I was just putting out some YouTube videos and podcasts that some people checked out, pushing for Byrne and sort of articulating the case. You were inside the campaign. And then we both, made the same move, which overall a vast majority of people who supported Byrne did, which was recognize that, of course, and I think anybody who doesn't recognize that having Hillary and Clinton in office would be preferable to Donald Trump at this point, I don't know what to say to you would be the most polite thing I could say. But it seemed like what we were setting up under Clinton, which was, I think, would have been very healthy, was you would have marginalized to some extent the far right, and then you would have had this internal battle between actual progressive politics as exemplified by Byrne and the sort of sclerotic, exhausted neoliberal consensus as exemplified by Hillary Clinton. Now, instead of having that internal debate where we're kind of moving to the next waves of what we need to do in terms of dealing with the inequality crisis, in terms of dealing with the policing crisis, in terms of dealing with disparities across the board, now, the whole game is up for, we have an administration that's coming in with no popular mandate, and they're talking about, taking us to the medieval ages. And I guess my question is what's your vision for how do we have resistance, but then at the same time, if it's possible, still maybe even on like a local level, still be pushing in the right direction so that states and cities can become sites not only of resistance of this disastrous agenda, but also, incubators for actually solving problems so that at the same time we can move the ball forward and maybe actually exemplify what a progressive agenda would look like while this, assault is raining down from up top.
Absolutely. I know I was hoping that my biggest problem in 2017 would be whether or not I would find a place to be able to be effective in pushing Hillary to the left.
Right.
And so that would have been great problems. Those are much better problems from the problems that we have right now.
You pick your enemies and you pick your problems. People, that's a basic political understanding.
You choose who you get to negotiate against. And I would much rather be negotiating against them than like moving them to the left.
Right. Of course.
This is not what I want to be doing right now. But I don't have a choice. We tried really hard and we came up short. And now we have to deal with the consequences of that failure. I think it's great. I think if you look at, so I helped lead an action last week in New York City where we did a huge rally outside the Trump Hotel about showing how mayors and communities can resist Trump. And I think that's exactly where it is with local. But it can't just be cities. We need to be looking at how can progressive pockets in rural communities resist. It's not just people who live in cities who should be able to have local protections against Trump. We need to make sure that if you're in a rural community, if you're exurban, if you're suburban, that we are empowering local electeds and local communities to be able to push those, whether it's sanctuary cities, whether it's protecting abortion access, protecting the environment. We need to be working with faith groups. If you can't get like a small town in Nebraska to be a sanctuary city, can we get a church there to say that we will be sanctuary?
Right.
That if Trump is sending ICE into this town to do raids, that we will have cots here. You can stay here. You can take shelter here.
Right.
We need to really be thinking outside of the box of how we can really do that. And that needs to come from the Democratic Party. Our leaders in the Democratic Party, whether you're organizers or your elected officials or your party leadership, needs to be on the front lines. It can't just be outsourcing our progressive advocacy to the groups on the outside. Like the groups on the outside play a super important role right now, but it's also the party. Like our people need to see that the party does more than just sending out emails saying the sky is falling.
Right. The sky is falling. Give us money.
Yeah.
So Melissa, how can people find out more about your race and just more kind of generally how they can get involved in this very real, tangible, on the ground way that you're talking about? Because, I think like the protests this past weekend were amazing and inspiring. And it just occurs to me, like, I think stuff like that is going to need to happen every week for the next 4 years. Like, I think people are going to need to be on the streets constantly. I think that, this agenda, and it's very important, and I know, it's not just Trump. It's a whole Republican agenda to make the country poorer, sicker, dumber. It's going to be relentless. So, we need to be relentless in response.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a website at melissafordnc.org. You can also go, my Medium post is where I have my very long platform, because I believe that you should also know my views and not just how I'm going to fix the party. So our values are essential to the work that we do. And so you can find me at Medium with my Twitter handle at MCBYRNE. That's at MCBYRNE. And on my Twitter page, on my Twitter and my Medium, there's a link to my fundraising link as well, because it's expensive to run for any kind of office. You have to fly to all these different forums, and you're supposed to make nice little stickers and lit and all that stuff. So I'm working on doing all that. It's very weird being a candidate.
Well, you're doing it well.
Very
you're doing
different
it well.
role.
You're doing it well, Melissa. And I really appreciate what you're doing, and I look forward to many conversations and actions with you in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope to be back on your show and we can all collaborate. We have so much work to get done. We have more work to get done that we need everybody. It's all hands on deck right now until we can go back to fighting with each other about how progressive to be. I don't want this fight back.
Those were the days. If I could just be making
able to yell at Obama about TPP.
Right.
Just go back to that.
Or being like, hey, great password projection, John Podesta. Ha ha. Versus oh my God, what the fuck?
Yeah.
Okay.
Although that's staffer,
fair enough.
That's staffers mess up.
Well, I wouldn't say that in my comedy routine, Melissa.
Yeah, for all the problems, I think that we need to get out of this battle mode of doing this back and forth of snide remarks about people, because we all have to fight together. And even if we can't stand some people about things, we have to put all of that aside, defeat Trump, and then get back to the other work.
Well, I can promise to put everything aside, but I cannot promise to not make snide remarks because it's part of my job.
Okay.
But I'm completely with you, Melissa.
Part of your job.
Thank you so much. Melissa Byrne, she's a candidate for DNC vice chair. Please check all of her work out. She is vital to the future of the Democratic Party and, by extension, the country. Thank you so much, Melissa. Talk with you soon. Okay, everybody, we are going to go to the fun half. We've got a ton to get to. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Write us a review on iTunes. Subscribe to Two Dope Boys in a Podcast. If you're in New York City, we'll put a link to our blog post. There's very few spots left, but Phil and I are doing a live show, a live Two Dope Boys taping at Ignition, which is a agency in New York City. There's also a communion event coming up, which are these events we do in the city. So those are all the ways you can connect. JustCoffee.coop, Fair Trade Tea, Coffee, Chocolate, kickbacks. If the weekend didn't remind you that you need independent media, I don't know what will. Let's get to the fun half.